We tend to view history as a straight line of events, recorded by honest observers and passed down to us intact. But when you look at the origins of the world's largest religion, that line isn't straight. It is twisted, broken, and in many places, completely erased and redrawn by people with an agenda. The story of Christianity as it is taught today is not the story of what actually happened. It is a story constructed decades and even centuries later, pieced together using mistranslations, political compromises, and convenient fabrications designed to turn a localized Jewish apocalyptic movement into a global empire. To understand how we got here, we have to look at the foundational claims, the myths that were engineered to look like history. The first crack in the foundation appears before the story even really begins. It starts with a prophecy. The entire validity of Jesus as the Messiah rests on his ability to fulfill the predictions of the Old Testament. If he didn't fit the description, he wasn't the guy. One of the most famous requirements is that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. This is a non-negotiable dogma for millions. But this requirement was based on a mistake. The author of the Gospel of Matthew was reading a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. He looked at the book of Isaiah, which used the Hebrew word Alma. In Hebrew, Alma simply means a young woman, usually of marriageable age. It does not mean virgin. If Isaiah wanted to say virgin, he would have used the word Betula. But the Greek translation used the word Parthenos, which strictly means virgin. Matthew, writing specifically to convince Jews that Jesus was their guy, looked at that mistranslation and constructed a narrative to match it. He needed a virgin birth because a bad translation told him he did. The story was written to fit the prophecy, not the other way around. This isn't divine intervention. It's literary reverse engineering. This pattern of inventing events to tick boxes continues with the location of the birth. The prophecies said the Messiah had to come from Bethlehem, the city of David. The problem for the Gospel writers was that Jesus was clearly from Nazareth. Everyone knew him as Jesus of Nazareth, not Jesus of Bethlehem. So, how do you get a family from Nazareth to Bethlehem to have a baby? You invent a census. The Gospel of Luke claims that Caesar Augustus decreed that all the world should be registered and that everyone had to return to their ancestral hometown to sign a piece of paper. History tells us a different story. The Romans were excellent bureaucrats. We have stacks of their records. There was never a census that required the entire Roman population to travel back to the cities of their distinct ancestors. It would have collapsed the economy and clogged the roads of the empire. It makes zero logistical sense. Furthermore, Luke claims this happened while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Quirinius did hold a census, but it happened in 6 CE, 10 years after King Herod, who is also in the story, had died. The timelines do not match. The writer of Luke broke the chronology of history and invented a global bureaucratic nightmare just to move the characters to the right set piece. Once you realize the writers were not recording history, but were crafting theology, the silence of the actual historical record becomes deafening. If a man walked around Galilee performing miracles, raising the dead, and feeding thousands, you would expect someone to notice. Yet, outside of the Gospels themselves, the contemporary world is silent. We have historians from that era, writers like Philo of Alexandria, who wrote extensively about the region and its philosophy. He never mentions Jesus. The only secular references we have, like those from Josephus or Tacitus, were written decades later, and the most famous passage in Josephus is widely considered by scholars to be a forgery inserted by later Christians to give their hero some historical weight. The man who supposedly broke the laws of physics and drew massive crowds managed to leave no imprint on the writers, politicians, or chroniclers of his own time. This forces us to look at the documents we do have. The Gospels. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are comfortable traditions, but they are just that. Traditions. The books themselves are anonymous. The names were attached to them in the 2nd century, nearly 100 years later, to give them authority. The actual authors were not eyewitnesses. They were highly educated Greek speakers writing in legitimate literary styles, not illiterate Aramaic-speaking fishermen from rural Judea. The first Gospel, Mark, wasn't written until roughly 40 years after the alleged crucifixion. That is a 40-year gap of oral tradition. Think about how much a story changes when passed from person to person over a week. Now try 40 years. By the time the ink hit the scroll, the story had been filtered through distinct communities, each with its own needs and theological arguments. You can actually see the legend growing if you read them in chronological order. In Mark, the earliest account, Jesus is very human. He seems distinct from God. He displays emotions, and he acts with secrecy. By the time you get to John, written much later, the human elements are stripped away. Jesus is suddenly a cosmic deity who talks in long, philosophical monologues that sound nothing like the parables in the earlier books. The man was being erased and replaced by a god. But if the Gospels are unreliable, who actually built the religion? That answer lies not in Jerusalem, but in the mind of a man who never even met Jesus. The biggest fabrication in this story wasn't about where Jesus was born or who wrote his biography. The biggest fabrication was the message itself. The Christianity we know today does not come from Jesus. It comes from Paul. Paul never met the human Jesus. He was a prosecutor of the early church who claimed to have a hallucinatory vision on the road to Damascus. Based on this private experience, Paul restructured the entire movement. The actual disciples, the people who supposedly walked, talked, and ate with Jesus, led by James and Peter, had a very different view. They saw their movement as a Jewish sect. They followed the law of Moses. They kept kosher. They practiced circumcision. Then Paul comes along and opens the doors to the Gentiles, telling them they don't need to follow the Jewish laws. This caused a massive rift. In the Bible, we see glimpses of this fighting, but it's smoothed over. In reality, it was a hostile takeover. Paul's version of Christianity, easy to export, stripped of difficult Jewish laws, focused on faith rather than rigid practice, was simply more marketable to the Roman world. The religion that survived isn't the religion of Jesus, it's the religion of Paul. This marketing strategy brings us to the core promise that holds the whole structure together, the afterlife. The concept of hell, as a place of eternal torture for non-believers, was not a staple of the Judaism Jesus was born into. The Jewish concept of Sheol was simply a grave, a shadowy place where everyone went, regardless of their morality. The idea of eternal punishment was largely imported from Greek influences and then weaponized. If you want to control a population, a carrot isn't enough. You need a stick. And not just any stick, but an infinite one. The Church Fathers developed the doctrine of hell to ensure compliance. It created a problem, eternal damnation, that only they could sell the solution to. This wasn't divine revelation. It was retention strategy. It preyed on the human fear of death and the desire for justice, promising that even if the wicked prosper on earth, they will burn forever later. It turned the religion into a protection racket. Even the central event of the faith, the resurrection, bears the hallmarks of psychological coping rather than historical fact. When a charismatic cult leader promises the world is going to change, and then is suddenly executed by the state, it creates a massive trauma for the followers. This is known as cognitive dissonance. The reality, our leader is dead, conflicts with the belief he was the Messiah. The human mind will go to extraordinary lengths to resolve this tension. We have seen this in modern doomsday cults. When the spaceship doesn't come or the world doesn't end on the predicted date, the true believers don't go home. They double down. They claim the prayer saved the world, or the leader ascended to a higher plane. For the early disciples, admitting they were wrong, and that Jesus was just a man who ran afoul of Rome, was too painful. The alternative, that he wasn't really dead, or that his death was part of a secret plan by God, was much more comforting. Visions of the deceased are a common psychological phenomenon among the grieving. One person has a vision, the power of suggestion takes over the group, and suddenly, the spirit is present. This psychological break from reality became the cornerstone of a new empire. As this movement grew, it didn't just rely on visions, it relied on politics. The Bible as we know it wasn't faxed down from heaven. It was voted on. For the first few centuries, there was no single Christianity. There were dozens of versions. Some believed Jesus was human, some believed he was a phantom, some believed there were two gods. These groups, like the Gnostics, had their own gospels and their own traditions. The unification of Christianity happened not because of truth, but because of imperial necessity. Emperor Constantine needed a unifying force for a fracturing Roman Empire. He didn't care about the theological nuances of the Trinity. He cared about stability. The Council of Nicaea, in 325 CE, was a political meeting. Bishops met to standardize the dogma. They voted on the nature of Jesus. They decided which books were in and which were out. The books that didn't make the cut were burned, and the people who held on to them were branded heretics and hunted down. The Bible is a curated anthology of the winners of a political struggle. We read the texts that supported the power structure of the Roman Church, not the ones that might have offered a different view of the teacher from Galilee. We must also consider the timing of the message. The Jesus of the Gospels is an apocalyptic preacher. He clearly believed, and told his followers, that the end of the world was imminent. He said, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have happened." Well, that generation passed away. The generation after it passed away. The world kept spinning. This was a failed prophecy of the highest order. When the apocalypse didn't happen, the church had to pivot again. They had to transform a message about the end of times into a message about the institution of the church. The kingdom of God shifted from a literal transformation of the earth to a metaphorical, heavenly kingdom that you enter after death. This shift allowed the church to settle in for the long haul, accumulating wealth and power in the here and now, while promising the payoff in the afterlife. They took a failed doomsday prediction and turned it into an eternal business model. When you strip away the stained glass and the choir music, what you are left with is a very human creation. It is a patchwork of older pagan myths, the dying and rising god, the Virgin Mother, the winter solstice birth, all rebranded for a new audience. It is a structure built on the mistranslation of Hebrew texts, the hallucinations of a grieving group of fishermen, the ambition of a Roman citizen named Paul who hijacked the movement, and the political shrewdness of an emperor who needed a tool to control his subjects. The creation of Christianity was not a miraculous intrusion of the divine into the mundane. It was a gradual, messy, and often deceptive accumulation of stories that people told themselves to make sense of a brutal world. It was the result of people refusing to let a dream die, even when the dreamer had been executed. It was the ultimate example of the sunk cost fallacy played out on a civilizational scale. We accept these stories today not because they hold up to scrutiny, but because they have been repeated with such confidence for so long that we forgot to ask where they actually came from. The reality is that religions are not discovered. They are made. They are made of our fears, our hopes, our need for control, and our inability to accept the finality of death. The lies that created Christianity were not necessarily malicious lies told by evil men, but comforting lies told by desperate ones, lies that were later seized upon by powerful men who saw their utility. Recognizing this doesn't require anger. It just requires the courage to look at the history without the lens of faith. Once you do that, the divine mystery evaporates, and you are left with something far more interesting: the complex, flawed, and fascinating machinery of the human mind.